Maritime commerce in Ventura County was actively pursued by the seafaring Chumash in the region of the Channel Islands for 1,000 years before the coming of the white man. However, the greatest impetus to modern coastwise commerce came with the arrival of Thomas R. Bard in 1865 as an agent for the Pennsylvania oil and railroad magnate Thomas Scott. Bard was a pioneer oil and land developer who would later become a noted community leader and founding president of Union Oil Company, and finally a United States Senator. In 1871, Bard laid out the town of Hueneme on the old Mexican land grant El Rio de Santa Clara o la Colonia, eventually making it his home. As early as 1867, he saw a need for a wharf in isolated Ventura County to serve the agricultural potential of the region, eventually selecting a site at Point Hueneme. By mid-1871, he had completed his wharf along with several huge warehouses for the storage of grain that consisted mainly of barley, wheat, and corn. Originally built to be 900 feet long, over the years it would be lengthened, eventually extending 1,700 feet into the sea. In a few short years, the little town of Hueneme could boast that it was the greatest grain port on the southern coast. By 1887, 236 vessels arrived in that year alone. Years earlier, it was learned that the stretch of south-facing coastline immediately west of Bard's newly constructed wharf, which narrowly enclosed a 100-acre salt marsh, appeared to be an ideal site for a future harbor. As early as 1872, E.N. Wood, writing in his guide to Santa Barbara Town and Country, informed his readers, quote, "Hueneme is a seaport town recently founded 15 miles below Ventura. It is accessible to sailing vessels and steamers, and the confirmation of the shore is that an ample and safe harbor can be constructed without an extravagant outlay," end quote. This observation is historically significant, for it is the first recorded account of the desirability of a landlocked harbor anywhere on the Ventura County coast, and particularly of Hueneme's suitability for its location. Hueneme's status as an important California seaport would end after a very successful run of more than a quarter of a century. In 1897, a few years after the pivotal introduction of sugar beets into Ventura County, a great sugar refinery was constructed 4 miles north of the wharf, in an area destined to be the new town of Oxnard. Within a few months, the Southern Pacific Railroad ran a spur to the plant, spanning the Santa Clara River for the first time and sharply curtailing commerce at the wharf. The bypassed little town settled down to a period of somnolence and decline. Thanks to the foresight of Thomas Bard's son Richard, Ventura County's maritime tradition was destined for a rebirth. Richard was steeped in the maritime experience fostered by his father and felt a compelling need for a harbor at Hueneme. From the time he first returned home after his graduation from Princeton in 1915, it was a cherished dream. Finally, 10 years later, in 1926, he began what would become a long, bitter struggle to make it a reality. In his efforts to establish a county-owned harbor at Hueneme, there developed fierce opposition from forces in the city of Ventura, who wanted the harbor to be located in their town. However, 4 successive surveys by the U.S. Corps of Engineers, beginning as early as 1879 and ending in 1926, all indicated that the Ventura roadstead was not suitable for a harbor. A harbor at Ventura, which by necessity required an expensive breakwater, was determined to be not economically feasible. However, even after the newly established Ventura County Harbor Commission agreed to construct the harbor at Hueneme at half the cost of the one at Ventura, the rival forces succeeded in killing the plan for a county-owned harbor, and Richard Bard, after a 4-year effort, was forced to abandon the idea.
As Richard Bard, my father, was working on plans for a harbor, his home at Barrelwood was an island of tranquility. The big house, as we called it, was designed by Myron Hunt, famous for the Rose Bowl and Huntington Museum. Barrelwood was a 20-acre botanical paradise created by my grandfather between 1871 and 1915, the year he died. Grandmother Bard, wheelchair-bound, loved the garden and taught countless grandchildren the names of many rare plants. It was a secret garden for children, with trees to climb, flowers to pick, and clumps of shrubs to play hide and seek in. While Grandmother lived in the big house, we lived in the bungalow, a cozy redwood structure. My father brought his bride, Joan Boyd of Santa Barbara, in 1915 to this house. I was their first child, born in 1917. As the family grew, so grew the house. Friends and relatives joined in picnics, tennis, and endless made-up games. Garden and home provided a peaceful world for children and a tranquil retreat for Richard Bard.
Undismayed by the failure of the county-owned harbor effort, Richard Bard then formed a privately owned corporation that eventually became the Hueneme Dock Corporation to build a harbor at Hueneme. To assist in obtaining investment capital for this project, he brought Mr. H.A. Forbes into the firm. When Bard learned that the federal government, as part of the National Recovery Act, was making funds available for this type of enterprise, he sent Forbes to Washington to make an application. Within 2 years, the Hueneme Dock Corporation succeeded in getting an allotment of $1,600,000 from the Public Works Administration, PWA, where Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes served as administrator. The grant was based on matching funds of $900,000 to be provided by the Dock Corporation. Of this amount, $250,000 was already provided for with the land at the harbor site owned by the Barrelwood Investment Company, the family business that Bard managed. Another $250,000 was provided by the acquisition of the Ventura County Railroad as an investment by the American Beet Sugar Company. Thus, Richard Bard was left with the task of finding investors to cover the remaining $400,000.
Oh, to be young again. I can remember when I was little, my older brother and I would ride the red trolley to the beach in Hueneme. We would catch a trolley at the corner of A Street and 8th, where the Oxnard Elks Club is located. Our mother would give us an extra dime so that we could spend it at Henry Horsewood's concession stand, as we always looked forward for this treat. When we arrived at our destination at the bottom of the wharf and in the first part of the Lima Bean and warehouse, we would pick up our bucket with our gunny sack and we would proceed up to the old wharf. We would stop and greet the old fishermen fishing off the wharf. Some had poles, others had drop lines. Some had fish in their buckets, others didn't. So we would walk to the end of the wharf, following the railroad that was on the wharf. We would then turn back, and some of the fishermen would give us some of their catch. We then went under the wharf. I pulled off some mussels. My mother would say to us, "Don't bring too many mussels, because you kids won't eat them." It was fun to pull the mussels off the piling. Then we walked along the beach to gather clams when in season. These we liked. Then it was on to Henry Horsewood's concession stand. You name it, and he sold it or he rented it. He was a large, jovial man, always singing. He was always dressed in the costume of the month, or in a tux and a high-top hat. He had good hot dogs and hamburgers, also peanuts and popcorn. It being my specialty, for 10 cents you got a long paper bag full of popcorn, and he would pour warm melted butter over the popcorn in the bag. It was a treat. We got back to board the trolley home. Henry Horsewood was missed by many, but he lives in the memories of many of us.
This film footage undoubtedly produced to show graphically the time and expense required to truck agricultural produce from Ventura County to the Los Angeles harbor, and the obvious savings to the farmer if a harbor constructed at Hueneme. By this time, Richard Bard had commitments from local investors in the amount of $200,000, which was enough to qualify for the federal allotment. The remaining $200,000 could be postponed to a future date. It was anticipated that construction could begin at a very near future. Even though the government had executed the loan agreement with Hueneme Dock Corporation, and the last hurdle had been cleared to begin harbor construction, Richard Bard was astonished by news from Washington that Ventura's ongoing vindictive campaign to stop the construction at Hueneme was working. It was learned that the appropriation was in big trouble and had been sent to the investigation division of the PWA. In an effort to rectify the problem, Bard hurried to Washington to have a face-to-face talk with Ickes. In a letter to his wife dated January 19, 1935, Bard poured out an incredible recital of what had transpired at that meeting.
Dear Joan, Mr. Ickes practically told me I was a crook and a liar yesterday. He said the project was nothing but speculation, and that I got word about his feelings from some underground pipeline in his organization. This was after I said I knew from what our enemies in California had said. They must have represented to him that the proposition was a land speculation. He said, "No, you got that information here." I said I regretted he felt that way, but I knew these statements were made in California. I said I wanted the opportunity as president of the Dock Corporation of assuring him that the project was not speculation. He said it was speculation and the government couldn't lend its money for private individuals to profit by. What could it be but speculation? I told him it was for the purpose of providing cheap transportation for a large area and industrial development. He said the support the project was getting from people in his organization didn't help our cause any, inferring they were getting something for supporting it, not from sincere support because of its merits alone. Seeing how obsessed he was, I didn't prolong the subject further.
Nevertheless, even though a contractual agreement had been entered into, Harold Ickes rescinded the PWA allotment on the basis of a new ruling that only public organizations, not private, could receive federal funds. To remedy this problem, Bard donated 247 acres of land and all the rights of way and franchises to the city of Oxnard to enable the grant process to proceed. Because of still another new ruling by the PWA requiring the formation of a harbor district to become eligible, the Oxnard Harbor District was established. Nevertheless, even then, the federal government saw fit to withhold the funds. The harbor district did not receive 1 cent of government money. As a result, the newly formed Harbor Commission successfully proposed a bond election in the amount of $1,750,000 to fund the project. By this time, Richard Bard had spent $500,000 of his own money over a 14-year period to make the harbor at Hueneme a reality. Prominent Port Hueneme pioneer Walter Miranda has left an excellent contemporary account of the area selected for the harbor and the adjacent town.
Hueneme was a town of about 800 people with almost no sidewalks and very few paved streets. There was a 40-acre lagoon on the east, 100 acres of salt flats on the west, with miles and miles of drainage canals flowing through tidal gates at Point Hueneme near the lighthouse. Salmon would come into the canals to spawn and die. West of the canal, which separated the salt flats from sand hills, were 3 beach subdivisions continually struggling against blowing sand, beach erosion, and flooding from either rains or high tides. To the north was farmland for 4 or 5 miles before you came to the city of Oxnard. On the south were beaches, a boardwalk, wharf and warehouses, and a swampy area that drained to the lagoon. The Ventura County Railroad went through and over a trestle across the lagoon. Most of the people seemed to know everybody else in town. The one common desire was to build a harbor in the salt flats west of town.
The firm of Quinton Code, Hill, Leeds, and Barnard were the engineers chosen for the project, with Major Forrest S. Harvey selected as resident engineer. The overall design was a work of Colonel Lees, who had worked closely with Richard Bard for 10 years during the harbor struggle. On February 4th, 1939, an expected crowd, estimated at between 4,000 to 6,000 people, gathered at the harbor to witness the long-expected groundbreaking ceremonies. With the speeches concluded, the main event was at hand, when Bard's 10-year-old daughter Margaret came out of the crowd and handed her father, then rightfully hailed, the father of the Port of Hueneme, the golden shovel to turn the first shovelful of sand. Before dredging could begin, it was first necessary to form giant basins surrounded by dikes or levees to impound the sand and mud. Most of the levees ranged in height from 5 to 10 feet. A huge drag line was brought in to do much of this work, but much of it was accomplished by using bulldozers. One of the first levees was constructed parallel to the west jetty, the area where most of the initial dredging would take place. In another area, to make a place for about 400,000 yards of dredged sand, Richard Bard and the Barrelwood Investment Company purchased the so-called Hueneme Slough. Bard also contracted to have 2 levees constructed around the property, 17 feet high on the south and 13 feet on the north. Much of this filled site today is a popular Miranda Park. The Standard Dredging Company won the bid to complete the first phase of the harbor construction. This included all of the dredging and the rock work, including the building of the jetties. They named the Roll Conley Company as subcontractors to do all the rock work. The rock was brought by barge from a quarry on Catalina Island, 57 miles away. Generally, 2 barges were towed by 1 tug, requiring about 23 to 30 hours, depending on the weather. The original plan was to have the first load delivered and dumped by February the 4th to coincide with the groundbreaking ceremony. However, the month of February was very stormy, even washing out the loading pier at Catalina Island, causing a serious delay. On March 5th, over a month later, the first load of rock arrived at the site of the West Jetty, where 1,400 tons were dumped in one day, some 200 feet offshore. About 1,000 observers were on hand to enjoy the spectacle. This event was so special, a piece of one of the rock was put on display at the offices of the Oxnard Daily Courier, and then given to the Pioneer Museum for future keeping. Another necessary aspect of the harbor construction was to satisfy the demand for additional electrical power and all the other utilities, including new water lines and proper sewage disposal and drainage. The Edison Company was heavily involved in this project and was a subject of considerable amusement when the meter they installed ran backwards.
In 1939, Hueneme, known to me as a small fishing village where sailing ships had stopped to unload cargo, had a population of around 3,000 and a school district of only 1 school and 250 students. My first visit here brought me to Homer Barr's real estate office, where I was to see him regarding a teaching position. He, Mr. Richard Bard, and Mr. Glenn Dewar made up the school board. In Mr. Barr's absence, I was referred to Mr. Dewar at the Red and White grocery store. As I drove to the downtown area to meet with him, I passed the Hueneme Bank, the Burlwood Investment Company, Aristegui's Grocery Store, Baker's Garage, the Office of the Justice of Peace, where Judge Lawrence Miranda presided, Ace's Cafe, Hazard's Barbershop, the post office with Art Haycox as postmaster, the Red and White Grocery Store, and Mac's Candy Store, where there was a popular marble machine. Mr. Dewar interviewed me briefly, and at a later date, on Mr. Dewar's recommendation to Mr. Bard and Mr. Barr, I was awarded a contract to teach at $1,350 a year, $250 higher than the state minimum at that time. School began on September 5, 1939, and after having become somewhat familiar with the town, the downtown area, the boardwalk, the wharf, and Horsewoods Beach Resort, I returned to my home in Los Angeles on the third weekend of September. When I returned, I found the terrible damage left by a hurricane which had destroyed the aforementioned landmarks of the town. In later years, my husband Walter Miranda referred to the storm as Hurricane Jeanette.
All too frequent problems during the entire year of 1939 were the unusual stormy weather conditions causing extremely rough seas that hampered construction efforts. It was computed by the Roll Connolly Company that $10,000 worth of rock had been lost in the sea between Catalina and Hueneme. On April 13th, particularly perilous seas caused the order, supplying a good part of the agricultural industry in Central and Southern California. Today, competent economic studies reveal the total impact of the Port of Hueneme on the economy of